Hello and welcome to Deep Noetics. Today I'm going to present to you two articles where I've been digging deep into conspiracy theories, conspiratorial narratives about history, and finding the primary sources on what essentially is true and what is false about these stories. I explore some of the most prominent and I would argue most deep researchers into conspiracies, for example, Milton William Cooper and David Livingston. And I analyze where they are right, where they may be too far fetched, and what a true kind of deep history of our time can look like, and what we need to focus on, and what the role of secret societies, cults, and sects really was. For this, I've written two articles, one in August last year, titled Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new secular order, famously written on the Great Seal of the United States, and another one titled So Who Were the Illuminati? Both of them are relatively long and well researched. I recommend to check out both of them, and I'll jump right in. How a new world was born through the paradox-ridden entrance of ancient cults. Throughout the 14th century, a world was collapsing. The High Middle Ages, characterized by the dominant and determinative existence of the Crusades, a strong papacy, and the Order of the Knights Templar, was slowly fading and giving way to a new paradigm. This new status quo initially began to surface in the form of free merchant city-states, such as those of the Hanseatic Union, as well as the merchant republics established by Venetian, Genoese, and Florentine bankers. The fall of the feudal system that had dominated the previous centuries, together with the collapse of many Islamic empires due to Mongol invasions, opened the way to a new world, one that would fundamentally transform humanity. We remember this time of transition as the periods of Renaissance and Reformation, times in which previous dogmas softened and yielded to a new kind of Enlightenment culture, which, albeit still in its infancy, was ready to transform the mind and soul of European man. Enlightenment is often seen as a departure from dogmatic religious beliefs and blind faith, but it should rather be depicted as the emergence of a new kind of Enlightenment philosophy, one that had its origins in an esoteric worship of the human intellect. Quoting Milton William Cooper from his show was titled The Hour of the Time, and he had a series called Mystery Babylon, which has a transcript that I'm quoting here. So Bill Cooper is an interesting figure. He had a radio show in the 90s. He famously predicted 9/11, as they say. You can check it out for yourself. And he had a grand theory about a conspiracy going back throughout the ages to the mystery cults of Babylon. One which now includes the Freemasons, the Jesuits, and other groups. A lot of his theories, I would say, are far-fetched, or in the sense he makes connections where there may not really be one. But his research goes really deep. He goes into primary sources. He reads Isis and Osiris by Plutarch and other works like that date back to antiquity. And there are indeed some interesting historical interpretations that he delivers that can be useful for us. Quoting him now, "Remember, I told you Osiris is the symbol of the sun, but the sun was the symbol of power of the all-encompassing God of the universe. And later you're going to learn that the light, or the sun, represents something even deeper. It represents primordial knowing, the gift of the intellect, and where people can read these myths and think that these people really worship the sun or some god somewhere, they are mistaken. For the true object of their worship is the intellect, and through the use of that intellect, they believe that man will become God." On an overall geopolitical and historical level, this renewal of European society was brought about by four fundamental forces. First, the expansion of the Ottoman Empire and the eventual fall of Constantinople to the Turks. Second, the emergence of Renaissance culture in Italy. And third, the discovery of the New World. And lastly, the Reformation. Most of these developments had their own myriad causes, and were interrelated with one another. So the fall of Constantinople, or the consolidation of the Spanish Empire, both contributed to the Renaissance, the emergence of the Renaissance in Italy, where, for example, a lot of Greek texts were rediscovered that were transferred from the fallen Byzantine Greek Empire. Each of the historical processes that have shaped our modern world can be studied in great detail, but beneath each of them lies a deeper, more opaque force driving European ideologies and ambitions. The force of secularism, a project which would later transform itself into our modern liberal, socialist, and nationalist political ideologies. Many would identify the Reformation as the originator of secularism, but reform did not simply come about as a mere rejection of church dogmatism. In order to peer behind the veil of the Reformation, we need to familiarize ourselves with the version of Catholicism that emerged after recovering from the collapse of the medieval system. It was actually this form of the church that piqued the ire of opposition reformers and gave rise to the series of wars led against a rising imperial Spain ruled by the powerful Habsburg dynasty. Spain's expulsion of its Jews, thereby dispersing conversos and marranos, crypto-Jewish converts to Christianity, across Europe, profoundly influenced the Renaissance and Reformation and expedited the propagation and study of the Kabbalah, which was to have a major influence on Christian doctrine. Quoting here from Frances Yates, from her book The Occult Philosophy in the Elizabethan Age, I can recommend her works a lot. She's written many books. I think this is like part of a 3-part series where she goes into the Rosicrucians and also Hermeticism and its influence in the Renaissance on people like Giordano Bruno. So in any sense, a deep or like properly scholarly analysis of the occult undercurrents of that period, there is none that I can recommend as much as Frances Yates. Quote, "Moreover, this was the side of Renaissance Neoplatonism which developed and expanded most strikingly after the time of Ficino and Pico. Probably through the influence of exiled Jews of the expulsion, the interest in Kabbalah increased enormously in the later years of the 15th century and throughout the 16th century. The Kabbalist influence on Renaissance Platonism, Neoplatonism, increased accordingly and tended to affect the movement in a more intensely religious direction, and more particularly in the direction of the idea of religious reform. In the realm of church politics, the impact of the fall of Constantinople cannot be underestimated as a major event changing the course of European history. Historically, the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire had been the center of the Christian world. Most of the major patriarchates of Christianity were in the East: Antioch, Alexandria, Nicaea, where we find the oldest traces of Christian scholarship. Rome, by contrast, appears as an outlier, constantly struggling with invasions from Germanic peoples, tribes that were either still pagan or adherents to the now heretical Arian Christianity. Later, during the 9th and 10th centuries, the Roman Church developed a distinct structure of its own, resting its power on collaboration with German kings. This alliance engaged in centuries of warfare with northern tribes, beginning with battles against pagan Vikings and arguably even continuing into what we call the Reformation. In many ways, the Reformation simply represented an extension of this same struggle between the Roman Church and the northern tribes. You can see today that most of the Catholic part of Europe is the area that used to be part of the Roman Empire. Most of the Protestant areas are those areas that were, for most of the time, barbarian areas outside of the Roman Empire. Maybe with the exception of Britain, the notable exception. But you look at the 30-Year War, and some of the biggest leaders and benefactors on the Protestant side were Prussia, which is in the north of Germany, or northeast, and Sweden and England. Therefore, the Roman Catholic Church can be seen less as the core of the Christian world and more as an outlier for much of the early medieval period. Only the Crusades began to provide in some ways the very legitimacy to the Roman Church which it had lacked in previous centuries. This was achieved by rallying various Germanic kingdoms, mostly Frankish, towards a common cause, the invasion of the Holy Land. Politically, the conquest of the Holy Land was not the Crusades' primary objective. Rather, it was the domination of the Eastern Roman Empire, and in fact all European Christians by Rome. The Crusades were an immediate political success only insofar as they established an increased control of the Roman Church across various Christian realms. Their stated goal of reconquering the Holy Land only provided a limited amount of direct advantages to the Church. You can really see it in the reign of the most powerful Pope, Innocent III. Two of his crusades didn't even end up going to the Holy Land. One of them ended up sacking the Byzantine Empire, basically consolidating him as the sole ruler of Christendom, and the other one went into southern France, into Languedoc, to fight the Cathar heresy. Not the Holy Land at all. It was a clear example of the consolidation of power in Rome. Beyond the First Crusade, victories against the Saracen warriors of the Islamic caliphates were rare. Moreover, before the First Crusade, the Holy Land had been under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate, which the Crusaders rarely directly attacked, as the Venetian and other Italian financiers of the Crusades maintained favorable trade relations with the Fatimids. The initial target of the Crusades, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, was chiefly chosen not because it occupied the Holy Land, but rather because it occupied bountiful cities of the Eastern Roman Empire. I need to note that later crusades certainly did go to Egypt, but that was after the Ayyubid Caliphate, or the empire of Sultan Saladin, had conquered them, and they were no longer part of the Fatimid Caliphate. The Fatimid Caliphate had been entirely dissolved, and with it, the only caliphate of that period that was Shiite. Fast forward to 1453, the fall of Constantinople ultimately solidified the dominance of Rome across the Christian sphere. Refugees from the Eastern Empire flooded into Italy and helped to bring about what we call the Renaissance, a renewal of art, science, culture, and architecture, fostered both by the arrival of scholars from the sophisticated Byzantine world and by refugees from the Iberian Peninsula. You can see a new Rome, even though it was very powerful, and a lot of the works, like the Sistine Chapel, all of the famous artwork and just beauty of the Vatican came about in that period, but it was a very new kind of Rome. If you look at this picture where Adam is depicted with God and God is depicted as a bearded man, such a depiction would not be acceptable in earlier times. I'm not sure if Innocent III would have even allowed or approved this as having a depiction, a kind of Hellenistic, a pagan Greek depiction of God as Zeus, basically, as a sky father with a beard. Spain had undergone the reverse transformation of Byzantium in the 14th and 15th centuries, where formerly Muslim land was conquered by Christians, initiating a newly established inquisitorial state. Heretics, beginning with the Cathars and followed by Muslims and Jews, were purged from the peninsula and forced to flee, settling in other realms across Europe and the Mediterranean. Notably, we observe the rise of the conversos and marranos, Jewish converts who proclaimed Christianity while often maintaining Jewish practice in private. Many settled in the more open and tolerant societies of the Italian or Dutch republics. Especially in Italy, it was the combination of an already established intelligentsia and economic elite championed by the powerful dynasties of the Italian republics, such as Medici, Borgia, or Farnese, together with the influx of artistic and scholarly acumen through the refugees from Constantinople that created the breeding ground for the Renaissance. That sentence was way too long. I need to break it down a bit next time. This new hub of culture and creativity, the seedbed of a new Europe, generated two seemingly contradictory movements. On the one hand, there emerged a powerful Catholic movement in Spain, the first to colonize vast parts of the world and to build a truly global empire of trade and conquest. On the other hand, we have the Reformation, Martin Luther famously visited Rome, observed what he perceived as the debauchery and decadence of the Holy See at the time, and, inspired by the radical preacher Savonarola, called for a return to a more observant version of Christianity that, in his view, the Catholic Church no longer adhered to. He is Girolamo Savonarola, often overlooked figure of the Reformation, but very crucial, very important. Prosperity and literacy facilitated the distribution of a multitude of texts which until recently had been preserved in the Arab world. Ancient philosophy, Hermetic writings, and various Jewish mystical and esoteric teachings. While the disintegration of church authority in parts of Europe initially splintered Christian faith into conflicting sects, the various Protestant denominations required a new unity to withstand the concerted onslaught of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Hence, we see the emergence of societies such as the Rosicrucians and other groups that blended mystical traditions, Kabbalistic Christianity, and Hebrew scholarship. These early reformists began weaving together reinterpretations of the Bible and advancing forms of Christianity that eventually culminated into an Enlightenment ideology that was to characterize what we know as modern Europe. So the church had an organized structure. The Protestants were basically at a disadvantage because every Protestant, in a way, had their own, or every Protestant group had their own interpretation of the Bible. In a sense, they had to align in a way that permitted, you could say, more openness to various interpretations. Otherwise, they would be defeated. And this is how a dynamic like Rosicrucianism came about, where you had Puritans that were very, very zealous religious people, at the same time interested in mystical and Kabbalistic writings, as can be seen by the Hartlib Circle, for example. A new world was forming. The combined momenta generated by the Reformation, the rise of merchant city-states and international banking networks, and the Renaissance found its most powerful expression in the discovery and colonization of the Americas. It was Isaac Abarbanel, a famous Marrano in the Italian city-states, who funded Columbus' expeditions, and it was Joseph Nazi and other Marranos expelled from Iberia who first envisioned a Jewish return to the homeland of Palestine. At the court of Elizabeth I, the Magus John Dee syncretized Christianity with Kabbalistic, Hermetic, and alchemical traditions, laying the groundwork for modern science. Quoting again from Francis Yates' book on the occult philosophy of the Elizabethan age. As is well known, Dee was not only famous as a mathematician, but also famous or infamous as a conjurer. How did he manage to reconcile his scientific and occult interests with his earnest claim to be a devout Christian and with his support of the Tudor Reformation? I believe that the answer to this question lies in realizing that Dee was a Christian Kabbalist, supporting the more powerful philosophy implicit in Neoplatonism as understood by Pico, Reuchlin, Georgi, Agrippa, as developed in the Renaissance occult tradition. Some people like Henry Bortoft say that even someone like Isaac Newton wasn't purely a scientist, but potentially one of the last magi, one of the last magicians in the tradition of John Dee. All of the aforementioned developments make it clear that Enlightenment and modern science did not simply represent a departure from religious dogma towards an unbound secularism free of superstition. Rather, they emerged from fervent religious belief, one that had long survived in the occult and the esoteric tradition of Hellenized, Kabbalistic, Christian, Jewish, and other teachings. Understanding each strand of this development requires extensive research. The Puritans, the dominant group among the early English settlers in what would later become the United States, were a radical religious sect that synthesized new interpretations of scripture not found in the dominant Catholic doctrine. In the writings of figures such as John Milton, we find a sophisticated pantheon of occult angels and demons accompanying the story of Paradise Lost and Regained, Milton stands as a clear example of a Puritan Christian influenced by Kabbalistic Christianity and other occult currents. Quoting again Francis Yates, that there was an influence of Kabbalah on Milton is now generally recognized. The suggestion of such an influence was startling novelty when first put forward by Denis Saurat. Saurat believes that Neoplatonism was too easy an answer to the problem of Milton's sources, arguing that there is also a Kabbalist influence on the poet. Saurat was looking for traces of genuine Jewish Kabbalah in Milton's poetry and believed that he had found echoes of characteristic doctrines of Lurianic Kabbalah in Paradise Lost. Lurianic refers to Isaac Luria, one of the major authors of the Kabbalistic mystical tradition. The later rise of Freemasonry and Enlightenment secularism can be seen as the emergence of a society that worships reason and the intellect. This worship is not objectively neutral or devoid of doctrine. It is a new dogma, an ideology of a new order of global power, a new world order. This idea is captured in the motto on the Great Seal of the United States, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new secular order, a worldly order that evades the power of the church and grants authority to the human intellect. The historical secrecy surrounding these teachings have led many to trace the recent global unification of power back to hidden conspiracies. To what extent this was a strategically coordinated development, or merely an unguided evolution spurred by the energies of unconscious religious and ideological fervor, remains unclear and is left to the reader's interpretation. Even the so-called scientific revolution did not happen in a vacuum. It was driven by people with passionate religious and often occult beliefs. Roger Bacon, for example, is linked to the Rosy Cross, and Isaac Newton wrote extensively on Hermeticism as well as on biblical interpretations of the Apocalypse. I'm quoting here David Livingstone. Everyone should check out his website, ordoapkeo.ca. Most of his books are there for free for everyone to read. He's been on this channel before, and a very thorough researcher with a lot of sources. He's got an encyclopedic memory, very impressive man. Does not mean I agree with every connection he makes. He likes to connect people across movements and political boundaries that may not have been as connected as he makes them out to be. But it's definitely worth reading. It's definitely worth checking out. Newton, president of the Royal Society, was committed to interpretations of the restoration of the Jews to their own land of Palestine and spent the remaining years of his intellectual life exploring the Book of Daniel. In his library, Newton kept a heavily annotated copy of the Fame and Confession of the Fraternity, R.C. Thomas Vaughan's English translation of the Rosicrucian Manifestos. Newton's writings suggest that one of the main goals of his alchemy may have been the discovery of the Philosopher's Stone, and perhaps to a lesser extent, the discovery of the highly coveted elixir of life. Newton also possessed copies of Themis Aurea and Symbola Aurea Mensae Duodecum by the alchemist Michael Mayer. As a Bible scholar, Newton was initially interested in the sacred geometry of Solomon's Temple, dedicating an entire chapter of the chronology of ancient kingdoms amended. Found within the book are several passages that directly mention the land of Atlantis. Newton believed that before its corruption, a scientific priesthood secretly maintained the original primordial religion. In particular, the priests knew that the sun and not the earth was the center of the universe. And therefore the ancient temples, from Stonehenge to the temple in Jerusalem, were organized around perpetual fires that represented the sun. Detailed imaginings of prophetic fulfillment, the establishment of a new Jerusalem, a new land, a return of the Jews to the Holy Land, were renewed during the decline of Catholic dominance across Europe. Fundamentalist Puritan settlers of the New World often regarded themselves as a vanguard whose duty it was to lay claim to and populate a New Jerusalem. These trends and developments laid the foundation of what would later culminate in Zionism, the upsurge and popularization of occult themes in a nominally secular society in the 20th century. In Zionism, we witnessed the return of a people whose cohesion and unity was maintained through a common belief in ancient texts. Paradoxically, all this was occurring alongside the secularization of European society. In Messianic Judaism and later Zionism, the inherent paradox between secular Enlightenment culture and radical esoteric religious beliefs came to the fore. As Zionism emerged politically in the 19th century, the contradictions intrinsic to modernity and to the common assumptions underlying the modern project manifested themselves in full and open display. The secular world order gave credence and support to an ideology inherently only sustainable by fundamentalist religious beliefs, yet the principal proponents were primarily secular atheists inhabiting an increasingly secular and secularized world. Here, a often quoted line from Ilan Pappé: "Most Zionists don't believe that God exists, but they do believe that he promised them Palestine." All of this coincided with the emergence of mass media technology, beginning with the printing press. Though the Chinese had invented printing centuries earlier, its adoption in European regions with phonetic alphabets allowed the rapid proliferation of literacy, especially in vernacular languages rather than Latin or Greek. This spread of literacy facilitated the proliferation of new ideas and helped to fan the flames of reformist movements and upheavals. In Spain, a new form of Catholicism arose with the Spanish Empire, one that was no longer impeded by the constraints that typified the Middle Ages. The first global state was being formed, establishing networks spanning across the Atlantic into the New World, and absorbing new influences from across the globe. The Jesuit order, in many ways, offered a model for a modern international institution of, and perhaps an example superior to, what the Rosicrucians or later Freemasons sought to emulate. In recent history, the rise of a literate society in mass media has been accelerating and instituted to the point of total ubiquity, with the help of newspapers, radio, television, and finally the internet. The radical, systematized dispersion of information has aided the dominant ideologies of this mass media system in constituting an intensified form of reality, something Baudrillard would refer to as the hyper-real. Even though new interpretations of religious doctrine have far removed themselves from their historical origins, they've become the more dominant, more powerful versions of Christian, Jewish, and other teachings. The enormous body of work produced by new technologies is creating a world of its own, shaping societies into a new kind of human existence. Quoting Jean Baudrillard from his work Simulacra and Simulation, this has, by the way, been an inspiration for the movie The Matrix. So in the beginning of The Matrix, Neo hides his secret utensils in a carved out book, and that carved out book is Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard. Today's abstraction is no longer that of the map, the double, the mirror, or the concept. Simulation is no longer that of a territory or referential being or a substance. It is the generation of bimodals of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. This is exemplified by the Masonic idea of the Great Work, the transformation of man, an idea mirrored in Illuminist, Jacobin, and other radical revolutionary movements in the wake of the Renaissance and Reformation. Quoting Manly P. Hall, his most famous work, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, he was a high-degree Freemason and claimed to be part of an ancient tradition. He says, briefly stated, the true purpose of ancient philosophy was to discover a method whereby development of the rational nature could be accelerated instead of awaiting the slower process of nature. This supreme source of power, this attainment of knowledge, this unfolding of the God within, is concealed under the epigrammatic statement of the philosophic life. This was the key to the great work, the mystery of the philosopher's stone, for it meant that alchemical transmutation had been accomplished. This new man comes into the world much like in the fictional realm described by Borges in Tlön Uqbar Orbius Tertius. A world elaborated so meticulously by a secret society of scholars and occultists that it outshines any scholarly work done on the real world and thus threatens to replace reality with its own idealist principle. Quoting here from Borges' novel, "The contact and the habit of Tlön have disintegrated this world. Enchanted by its rigor, humanity forgets over and again that it is a rigor of chess masters, not of angels. Already the schools have been invaded by the conjectural primitive language of Tlön. Already the teachings of its harmonious history, filled with moving episodes, has wiped out the one which governed in my childhood. Already a fictitious past occupies in our memories the place of another, a past of which we know nothing with certainty, not even that it is false. Numismatology, pharmacology, and archaeology have been reformed. I understand that biology and mathematics also await their avatars. A scattered dynasty of solitary men has changed the face of the world. Their task continues."